I want you to just imagine, just for a second, that you are treading water in the middle of the open ocean.
Oh, terrifying right off the bat.
Right. I mean, it is freezing, the water is this opaque, inky black, and suddenly, breaking the surface just a few yards away, you see this massive 6-foot-tall dorsal fin.
Just towering over you.
Yeah, and below that fin is a 6-ton, 22-foot-long apex predator. So you are sharing the water with a creature that is known to actively hunt great white sharks.
Which is wild to think about.
So it really is. An animal that coordinates with, like, military-level precision to take down baleen whales that just completely dwarf it in size. So by every single metric of biology and vulnerability, you are entirely at its mercy.
Completely.
Yet historically and statistically speaking, in that exact moment, you are incredibly safe.
It really is the ultimate paradox of marine biology. Because you are in the presence of the most efficient, powerful hunter on the planet, an animal that has conquered literally every ocean on Earth, and yet it is actively choosing to ignore you.
And we usually tend to think of apex predators as these instinct-driven biological machines. You know, the standard assumption is just, well, if you bleed, they bite. If you flee, they chase.
The whole Jaws mentality.
Exactly. But today, we are going through a stack of sources for this deep dive that completely shatters that baseline assumption. We are looking at everything from historical accounts of Australian whaling stations to some really cutting-edge machine learning research from the Earth Species Project, and of course, deep behavioral analyses from marine biologists.
It's a fantastic set of source material.
It really is. And our mission today is to answer one specific mystery. We aren't just looking at what these animals are, but who they are, how their cognition actually works, and why wild orcas essentially give humanity a free pass. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is that to understand why they don't hunt us, we first have to understand how they actually did hunt alongside us.
Which sounds completely contradictory, but yeah, the sources point us directly to a very specific pod in Twofold Bay.
Right, located on the southeast coast of Australia in New South Wales. We are looking at a period from the mid-1800s all the way to the 1930s. And the sources center heavily on a highly recognizable male orca, the locals named Old Tom.
And Old Tom was massive, right? Like weighing in around 6 tons.
Oh.
And he had this very distinct dorsal fin that bent at the top to the right.
Which made it super easily identifiable for decades, year after year.
Yeah, and he was part of a pod of about 20 to 30 orcas. And what I loved in the historical records, the ones meticulously kept by the whalers, is that they tracked distinct individuals.
They gave them names.
Right, they had names for them based on physical markers. So you had Taipei, Jackson, Humpy.
Stranger, Hooky.
Yeah, these weren't just anonymous animals passing through. They were recognized residents who returned to Twofold Bay every winter from like late May until early September, specifically to intercept the baleen whale migration.
And their presence in the bay wasn't just incidental to the human whaling operations happening on the shore.
Right.
They actively and intentionally integrated themselves into the human hunting process.
Which is just mind-blowing.
It is. The sources detail the Davidson family, starting with Alexander Davidson in the 1860s, who operated a shore-based whaling station in Kaya Inlet.
And while the broader whaling industry was, rapidly moving toward motorized vessels and explosive harpoon cannons, the Davidsons stuck to traditional unmotorized rowboats and hand harpoons.
Yeah, that adherence to a quieter, less disruptive method is likely what actually allowed this interspecies synergy to flourish in the first place.
Because the tactical coordination detailed in the sources is staggering. The prey here are baleen whales, which can run anywhere from 50 to nearly 100 feet long.
Massive animals.
Right. And the orcas didn't just attack en masse. The pod actually divided into 3 distinct specialized units.
It was a highly orchestrated deployment of resources. So the first group of orcas would position themselves strategically out in the open ocean.
Like a blockade.
Exactly. Acting as a barricade to cut off the baleen whale's escape route to deeper water. Then the second group handled vertical containment. They would swim directly underneath the whale to physically block it from diving down into the safety of the depths.
And then the third group.
The third group was the vanguard. They actively harassed the whale, biting at the highly sensitive lips and pectoral fins, and they would repeatedly leap out of the water to land their 6-ton bodies directly on the whale's blowhole to stop it from breathing.
Wow. So they were basically hurting them, driving these huge animals straight into the geographic bottleneck of Twofold Bay.
Yeah, but taking down a 90-foot whale is incredibly dangerous and energy-intensive for an orca. So once they had the prey trapped, Old Tom would break off from the hunt and swim directly to the Davidson whaling station.
To do what the whalers called flock tailing.
Right, exactly. Old Tom, or occasionally another designated member of the Todd, would position himself in clear view of the shore station, lift his massive fluke, and just repeatedly slap it against the surface of the water.
It's literally an acoustic alarm system. He was knocking on the door to wake up the humans.
That's exactly what it was.
Oh.
And when the whalers heard that rhythmic percussion echoing across the inlet, they would shout, "Rusho!" and deploy their rowboats.
Out in the bay, the orcas demonstrated this wild ability to differentiate between human groups. Like, the Davidson family painted their rowboats green, distinguishing them from the white boats of their competitors.
And the orcas noticed.
Yeah, they actively herded the baleen whales exclusively toward the green boats, entirely ignoring the rival whalers.
And the cooperation was highly physical, too. Historical accounts note that Old Tom would sometimes actually take the harpoon line in his mouth, acting as a tugboat to pull the rowers out to the open ocean faster.
Which is insane to picture. But also, if a whaler fell overboard in the middle of this chaos, which, let's be real, is highly likely when you're hand harpooning a panicked leviathan from a tiny wooden dinghy, the orcas would circle the man in the water, aggressively deterring sharks until he could be pulled to safety.
And in exchange, if an orca became entangled in the fishing lines or nets, the whalers would pause the hunt to carefully cut them free.
Which begs the obvious question. Why would an apex predator that has the intelligence to execute a three-pronged tactical blockade and the physical power to drown a baleen whale invite humans to deliver the killing blow? I mean, it sounds like a mafia shakedown to me. Like, the orcas do the heavy lifting of the ambush, but they need the humans' harpoons to finish the job quickly, so they demand a cut of the profits.
It's a great analogy. The historical texts actually refer to it as the law of the tongue. It was a negotiated biological contract based on mutualistic exploitation.
Right.
When the whalers killed the baleen whale, they didn't just haul it ashore immediately. They would anchor the carcass in the bay and leave it overnight.
Right, because the orcas only wanted one specific part of the animal, the lips and the tongue.
Yeah.
Which seems incredibly specific. Like, out of a 100-foot whale, they only want the tongue.
From an energetic standpoint, the tongue of a baleen whale is the ultimate prize in the ocean. It is immensely rich in lipids, highly vascularized, and it lacks the dense, fibrous connective tissue found in other parts of the body.
So it's basically pure calories.
Exactly. It provides a massive caloric payload for minimal digestive effort. Once the pod consumed the tongue and lips, they just abandoned the carcass. And this aligned perfectly with the human objective.
Because the whalers had no commercial use for the tongue.
Right. Their economy was based entirely on the blubber for oil and the baleen plates for manufacturing. So both species extracted their preferred, completely non-overlapping resource from the exact same kill.
That economic symbiosis is just fascinating. But what I found really compelling in the sources is the research from geneticist Isabella Reeves and Thawa traditional custodian Stephen Holmes, because they fundamentally rewrite the origin of this dynamic.
They absolutely do.
Because the history books traditionally credit the Scottish immigrant Alexander Davidson with forging this alliance in the 1860s. That narrative is entirely incomplete. This didn't start with European colonization.
No, the foundation of this relationship predates the Davidsons by thousands of years. It was established by the Katunga, the indigenous saltwater people of the Yuin Nation. Long before commercial whaling even existed, the indigenous communities had cultivated this profound integration with the ecosystem of Twofold Bay.
And for the Thawa people, this wasn't just a transactional resource exchange, right? It was deeply rooted in their spiritual cosmology. The sources say they referred to the orcas as biowas, which translates to brothers.
Yes. According to their cultural and spiritual framework, when a member of the Thawa people, specifically a whaler, passed away, their spirit was reincarnated in the form of a bioa. They viewed the orcas in the bay not as animals, but as the literal embodiments of their ancestors returning to assist their living relatives.
And there's a striking visual symmetry here highlighted in the sources. During traditional corroboree ceremonies, which involve music, dance, and interaction with the spiritual realm, the participants wore specific body paint and clothing that starkly contrasted black and white.
Deliberately mirroring the countershading of the orcas.
Exactly. So when a new orca with unique dorsal markings entered the bay, the community recognized it as a specific reincarnated ancestor.
This established a generational foundation of mutual trust. The indigenous locals had been ritually feeding and interacting with the bioas for millennia. So when Alexander Davidson established his commercial whaling station, his success was entirely predicated on his decision to employ indigenous whalers in his crew,
Treating them as equal partners.
which was a major anomaly for European settlers at the time. The Davidsons didn't domesticate the orcas. They were essentially vetted and granted access to an ancient, pre-existing alliance by the indigenous custodians of that relationship.
And the real tragedy here is how rapidly that millennia-old alliance collapsed. The sources outline the disintegration of the Twofold Bay ecosystem in the early 1900s. And it started with a fundamental breach of trust.
An orca named Typee stranded in the shallows and was actually killed by an outside local.
Yeah, and that betrayal caused many of the indigenous whalers to just permanently abandon the Davidson crew and Kia Inlet.
Compounding that localized betrayal was the global shift in the whaling industry. The advent of petroleum began replacing whale oil, and industrialized ship-based whaling fleets were just decimating the populations of baleen whales before they could even reach the migratory bottleneck of Twofold Bay.
So by 1926, the primary food source for the pod had been essentially eradicated from the region.
But Old Tom continued to return to the bay alone year after year, all the way until 1930. The local belief was that the rest of his pod had migrated further north into Jervis Bay and were slaughtered by Norwegian whalers.
Whalers who possessed no knowledge of the ancient pact and probably just viewed the orcas simply as pests competing for the dwindling whale populations.
Exactly. And the conclusion of Old Tom's life is this really stark illustration of the era's end. George Davidson eventually found him dead in the bay. Orcas experienced severe dental wear as they age, and Old Tom was essentially toothless and starving.
And the locals believe that was accelerated by a pretty specific incident, right?
Yeah, an incident involving a man named John Logan who engaged in a literal tug-of-war with Old Tom over a whale carcass using a motorized launch, the White Heather. The mechanical force of the boat actually dislodged several of the orca's remaining teeth.
Wow.
Logan's subsequent guilt actually led him to fund the preservation of Old Tom's skeleton, which remains on display at the Eden Killer Whale Museum today.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, if we extract the core biological data from the story of the Killers of Eden, it provides a pretty definitive answer regarding their cognitive architecture. Because to maintain that level of cooperation, an animal must possess advanced spatial memory, the ability to recognize specific visual markers like boat colors.
The capacity to innovate tactical hunting strategies.
Right. And most crucially, the ability to culturally transmit those localized traditions across generations.
Which naturally leads to the mechanics of that cultural transmission, because coordinating a multi-stage ambush, negotiating resource allocation with a totally different species, and instructing calves in these methods, that requires a highly sophisticated mechanism of information transfer.
It requires syntax.
Exactly, it requires language.
Which brings us squarely to the modern research detailed in the sources. Specifically, the pilot project being spearheaded by the Earth Species Project and the Rain Coast Conservation Foundation. They are operating off a research vessel named the Achiever up in Johnstone Strait, British Columbia, led by Dr. Valeria Vergara and Dr. Lance Barrett-Leonard.
The methodology being deployed on the Achiever right now represents a massive paradigm shift in cetacean bioacoustics, because historically, researchers like Dr. Vergara had to rely on manual acoustic analysis.
Meaning just sitting there with headphones on.
Right, spending thousands of hours listening to recordings, just trying to isolate individual calls. But now they are deploying a synchronized multimodal data collection array. They are flying aerial drones to capture high-resolution behavioral footage while simultaneously recording via underwater hydrophone arrays.
So they are time-aligning the data. They capture a specific burst of echolocation clicks, or like a pulsed whistle on the hydrophone, and they can cross-reference the drone footage to see exactly what the orca was doing at that precise millisecond.
Was it sharing a salmon? Was it reprimanding a calf? Was it turning sharply to the left?
It's basically like having the Rosetta Stone, but instead of translating Greek to Egyptian, we're using machine learning to decode terabytes of clicks and whistles to find the syntax of another species.
That's a perfect way to put it. By locking the acoustic data to the behavioral context, they are building a ground truth dataset. But the sheer volume of that data, we are talking terabytes of high-frequency audio and 4K video, is way beyond human capacity to process manually. And that is exactly where the Earth Species Project integrates foundation models and AI.
So instead of a human trying to guess the meaning of a whistle, they're using the same underlying architecture that powers large language models. But instead of predicting the next word in an English sentence, the AI is analyzing the latent space of the orca's acoustic emissions.
Looking for the underlying syntactical rules. The hidden grammar that governs how these sounds are structured and sequenced. The machine learning algorithms can detect micro variations in pitch, frequency modulation, and timing that a human ear just physically cannot perceive.
To identify the fundamental phonemes of their communication.
Yes. And once the model is trained on this localized, context-rich data from Johnstone Strait, it could be applied to decades of archived bioacoustic recordings globally. We could potentially decode patterns of communication we haven't even hypothesized yet.
Now, the sources stress that this isn't purely an academic exercise in decryption. There is an immediate critical conservation imperative driving this research, isn't there?
Absolutely. Dr. Barrett Leonard focuses heavily on the acoustic environment of the ocean. You have to remember, orcas are entirely dependent on sound. It is their primary modality for navigation, for hunting coordination, and for maintaining cohesion within their matrilineal structures. But the acoustic baseline of the ocean has been radically altered by human activity.
We're talking about acoustic masking.
Exactly.
Like the low-frequency rumble of commercial shipping lanes, the high-pitched cavitation of recreational boat propellers. It creates this impenetrable wall of noise.
And if the ambient noise level of the ocean drowns out the specific frequency a mother uses to maintain contact with her calf, the social structure breaks down. If a pod cannot hear the echolocation returns bouncing off a Chinook salmon because of a passing freighter, they literally starve.
So the urgency of the Earth Species Project is that if we don't understand the specific syntax and purpose of their vocalizations, we can't quantify exactly what survival mechanisms are being severed by anthropogenic noise pollution. We have to know what they're saying to know what we are silencing.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. The interviews with the researchers highlight just how deeply ingrained this acoustic culture is. Dr. Vergara details how different pods and even different matrilines within the same pod possess distinct regional dialects.
Just like humans.
Very much like humans. An orca off the coast of British Columbia sounds fundamentally different from one in the North Atlantic. Furthermore, these are highly cohesive societies led by older females. Orcas are one of the very few species on the planet, alongside humans and a couple of other whale species, where females undergo menopause.
Which is huge. The evolutionary biology of menopause is a crucial indicator of intelligence, right? Because in a purely instinctual, physically driven species, an individual's evolutionary value basically ends when they can no longer reproduce.
Exactly. The fact that female orcas live for decades past their reproductive prime points directly to the grandmother hypothesis. Their value to the pod shifts from reproduction to data storage.
Right.
They hold the ecological memory. Where to find food during anomalous climate events, how to navigate specific acoustic environments, and all the syntactical nuances of their dialect. They don't have the anatomical ability to build external data storage like libraries or hard drives, obviously. So their massive cognitive processing power is entirely dedicated to social cohesion, memory retention, and real-time acoustic communication.
Which brings us squarely to the central paradox of this deep dive. We have established that they possess immense cognitive processing power. They operate with complex syntax, they retain generational ecological knowledge, and they are highly lethal coordinated hunters capable of dismantling the largest animals on Earth.
Yes.
So when a human is swimming right next to them, essentially a slow-moving, poorly insulated mammal with absolute zero defensive capabilities, why do they ignore us?
The answer lies in the rigidity of what marine biologists term dietary culture. For an orca, a food source is not defined by its caloric availability. It is defined by a strict set of cultural parameters passed directly from the matriarch down to the calves.
And the sources provide a really stark illustration of this with the southern resident killer whales off the Pacific Northwest coast of the U.S. Because their culture dictates a highly specialized diet consisting almost entirely of Chinook salmon.
Right. And because human infrastructure, damming, and overfishing have completely decimated the Chinook salmon populations, the southern residents are facing a severe nutritional deficit.
Yeah.
Yet, despite being surrounded by other abundant marine biomass seals, sea lions, different species of fish, they will literally endure starvation rather than deviate from their cultural menu.
The adherence to the dietary tradition just overrides the fundamental biological drive for caloric intake.
Completely overrides it. Contrast that with the orcas observed off Bremer Bay in Western Australia.
Yeah.
The sources classify them as extreme generalists. Their dietary culture is incredibly broad. They hunt giant squid, bluefin tuna, deep-diving beaked whales, and even other apex predators.
But even with this highly adaptable, expansive menu, they still completely ignore humans in the water.
They do. If we look for an analog in human behavior, it's akin to strict religious or ethical dietary restrictions, such as observing kosher or halal laws, or strict veganism. It's like someone who has only ever eaten pizza, standing in a grocery store starving, but refusing to eat a carrot because their brain literally doesn't categorize it as food.
A person adhering to those cultural rules doesn't just view the prohibited food as unappetizing. Their cognitive framework categorizes it as fundamentally unconsumable, regardless of caloric need. So for an orca, a human simply does not exist within the conceptual category of prey.
Precisely.
But biologically, how do they know we aren't prey before they strike? If a surfer in a black neoprene wetsuit is paddling on the surface from below, the visual silhouette is virtually indistinguishable from a seal. A great white shark sees that visual cue, triggers a predatory response, and attacks.
That difference is rooted entirely in the neuroanatomy and the sensory modalities of the two predators. A great white shark relies heavily on vision, olfaction, smell, and electroreception. They are reacting to contrast and silhouette. Orcas, however, process their environment primarily through echolocation, which is interpreted by a highly developed neocortex and paralimbic system.
So they aren't just seeing a shadow on the surface, they are actively pinging the object with high-frequency clicks and reading the returning acoustic echoes.
Echolocation provides a granular, three-dimensional acoustic map based on impedance mismatch. When sound waves travel through the water and hit an object, they bounce back differently, depending on the density of the material. A seal is essentially a dense tube of thick lipid blubber and solid muscle.
Right.
A human in a wetsuit, on the other hand, is a relatively spindly, low-density skeleton surrounded by a thin layer of tissue with highly buoyant, air-filled lungs.
Wow. Okay.
So to an orca's acoustic processing center, the return echo of a human sounds absolutely nothing like the return echo of a seal. The acoustic signature immediately identifies us as anomalous and non-nutritive.
Which perfectly explains a behavioral divergence highlighted in the sources, the complete absence of the test bite.
Precisely. Sharks, lacking manipulative appendages like hands, have to use their mouths to investigate novel objects. If a shark is unsure if a silhouette is a seal or a piece of debris, it takes an exploratory bite to assess the fat content and texture.
And given the mechanical force of a great white's jaw, that exploratory investigation is often fatal for a human, even if the shark instantly recognizes the mistake and aborts the consumption.
Exactly. But marine mammals do not operate on a test bite protocol.
Because they can't afford to, right?
Yeah, it's exactly. For an orca, an ambush requires massive caloric output and highly synchronized pod movement. Striking an unknown target is inefficient and carries a huge risk of injury. Because their echolocation provides such a high-resolution acoustic analysis of the target's internal density, they know exactly what they're striking before they accelerate. The sensory data is fully processed by the neocortex prior to the physical engagement. Therefore, the mistaken identity paradigm that drives most shark encounters simply does not apply to an echolocating cetacean.
Which makes total sense.
Yeah.
Now, in the Reddit discussions included in the source material, there was this highly upvoted, somewhat dark theory that referred to orcas as the water Bundy.
Oh, yes, I saw that.
Yeah. The idea basically posited that orcas are these highly intelligent, homicidal apex predators who recognize that humans are the only other species on the planet capable of matching their capacity for organized violence. The theory suggests they leave us alone out of, like, a strategic respect or a fear of naval retaliation.
It is a really compelling narrative for a forum, but it is a textbook example of extreme anthropomorphism. It projects these highly complex human psychological frameworks like preemptive strategic deterrence, moral restraint, and interspecies diplomacy onto an animal whose cognition evolved in a completely different environment.
Right.
There is zero empirical data to suggest wild orcas operate through a lens of fearing human retaliation. Yeah. They're not conducting a geopolitical cost-benefit analysis before deciding not to eat a surfer. They ignore us because their sensory apparatus definitively identifies us as falling outside the evolutionary prey template they've spent millions of years optimizing. We simply do not register as food.
The biology and the cultural constraints explain the baseline behavior perfectly. But if their dietary culture is so rigid and they never view us as prey, how do we account for the anomalies? Because if you look at the news cycle, there are viral stories about orcas disabling boats, and we all know the devastating documentaries regarding captive attacks. If they are so culturally bound to ignore us, what happens when the rules break?
To analyze the anomalies accurately, we have to bifurcate the data into two entirely separate categories: the extremely rare physical interactions in the wild and the fatal pathologies of captivity. The etiology of the behavior in each category is fundamentally different.
Okay, let's examine the wild encounters first. The foundational statistic from the sources is absolute. There is no documented record of a wild orca ever killing a human being. But there have been a few physical interactions.
They are statistically microscopic, and when analyzed, they reveal very specific non-predatory motivations. For example, during Robert Falcon Scott's Terra Nova expedition to Antarctica in the 1910s, photographer Herbert Ponting was standing on an ice floe with sled dogs. A pod of orcas executed a synchronized maneuver to create a wave, attempting to shatter or tip the ice floe and wash them into the water.
But as the sources point out, that is their standard tactical protocol for hunting seals resting on ice. They assess a dark silhouette on a floe and deploy the hydrodynamics necessary to dislodge it. They weren't hunting a human, they were executing a seal hunting algorithm based on a visual cue in a high-contrast environment.
Exactly. When we look for actual physical bites, the data is essentially limited to a single well-documented case. In 1972, a surfer named Hans Kretschmer was bitten by an orca at Point Sur in California, requiring significant medical intervention, 100 stitches, I believe.
Right.
However, the environmental context is critical there. He used a black wetsuit in a highly active sea lion habitat. Marine biologists attribute this to an incredibly rare failure of sensory processing. Perhaps it was a juvenile orca that struck based on visual silhouette before fully resolving the acoustic data. Crucially, though, the moment the physical contact occurred and the orca realized the tissue density was incorrect, it aborted the strike and abandoned the area. There was no attempt at consumption.
The sources also note a 2014 incident in New Zealand where a free diver was pulled underwater for nearly a minute.
In that case, the diver had a catch bag filled with freshly harvested crayfish and sea urchins physically tethered to his arm. The orca was targeting the dense caloric mass of the harvested seafood, not the diver. It grabbed the bag, and because it was tied to the human was pulled down.
But as soon as the tether detached,
The orca departed with the crayfish, completely ignoring the vulnerable diver. It was an entanglement during a resource theft, not an attack on a person.
that explains the historical anomalies really well. But we have to address the current ongoing phenomenon off the Iberian coast. Because between 2020 and 2024, off the coasts of Spain and Portugal, there have been over 500 documented interactions where a specific pod of orcas is actively ramming and disabling medium-sized sailboats.
Yes, the Gladys pod.
Right, they are specifically targeting the rudders. They have caused massive structural damage and several vessels have actually sunk. And the sources point to a few specific juveniles driving this behavior, named Black Gladys, White Gladys, and Gray Gladys.
The Iberian interactions represent an unprecedented and highly localized behavioral shift, and it has generated intense debate regarding the underlying mechanism.
One of the theories outlined in the sources, put forward by Gibraltar-based marine biologist Eric Shaw, frames this as a defensive or retaliatory measure. He suggests that the orcas recognized the rudder as the functional tail or propulsion mechanism of the vessel.
Which is an interesting theory. In a hunting context, disabling the tail of a large prey animal immobilizes it. The hypothesis is that after a negative interaction with a vessel, perhaps a bilge strike or aggressive competition with fishing fleets, the matriarchs initiated a defensive protocol to systematically disarm vessels they perceive as threats in their territory.
But the sources seem to lean away from that.
Yeah, it is a logical deduction based on their hunting tactics, but it is not the consensus view among the biologists actively monitoring the Gladys pod. The prevailing data-supported theory is that this is not an act of aggression, defense, or interspecies warfare. It is a cultural fad driven by play.
A cultural fad, like they are tearing the steering columns out of million-dollar yachts because it's a trend.
It sounds absurd, but it requires a shift in how we view animal cognition. These are highly social, immensely intelligent animals with the neocortex optimized for complex interaction. When the local prey populations of bluefin tuna are abundant, their caloric needs are met quickly, leaving them with significant cognitive surplus.
Essentially free time.
Exactly. Like human teenagers, juvenile orcas engage in complex, tactile social play. The physical dynamics of a sailboat rudder moving through the water present a novel, interactive hydrodynamic toy. They apply physical pressure using the lever arm mechanics of the rudder to spin the vessel, or they apply bite force until the fiberglass snaps. Observers have actually documented the orcas swimming away with pieces of the broken rudder, interacting with the debris long after the boat is disabled.
Like carrying them around as trophies. And the most compelling evidence against the revenge theory is their behavior toward the humans during these events.
That is the definitive data point. In the instances where the structural damage has caused the vessel to sink, forcing the human occupants into the water, the orcas exhibit zero aggression toward them.
Which is incredibly telling.
If this were a coordinated retaliatory strike driven by a perception of humans as a threat, the people in the water would be utterly defenseless targets. Instead, once the physical object, the boat, is destroyed and no longer provides interactive feedback, the orcas lose interest and depart. The vessel is the stimuli. The humans are entirely irrelevant to the interaction.
That covers the wild behavior. But this deep dive really requires us to confront the fatal anomalies that occur in captivity. The documentary Blackfish obviously brought the story of the captive male orca Tilikum into the public consciousness, highlighting his involvement in the deaths of 3 people.
Yes.
If we establish that wild orcas definitively do not view humans as prey and possess intense cultural constraints against violence toward us, what neurological mechanisms fail in a marine park environment?
The captive environment induces a cascade of profound psychological and physiological trauma. We have established that a wild orca's biology is adapted for vast spatial ranges. They can travel up to 100 miles a day. And their cognition is heavily reliant on stable, lifelong matrilineal bonds and complex acoustic environments.
So when you extract an animal with that specific evolutionary profile and place it in a concrete tank, you are effectively inducing sensory deprivation and spatial confinement.
Exactly. The physical environment is acoustically reflective, meaning their primary sensory modality, echolocation, is constantly bouncing off flat concrete walls, creating an environment of constant acoustic stress.
Like living in a hall of mirrors, but for sound.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And socially, marine parks often force individuals from entirely different geographical cultures and acoustic dialects into close proximity. It is the equivalent of locking humans who do not speak the same language in a small room and preventing them from leaving.
Wow.
The result is chronic hyperaggression, extreme spikes in cortisol levels, and the development of stereotypic repetitive behaviors that indicate severe psychological distress. The collapsed dorsal fins, often seen in captive males, are a direct physical symptom of this unnatural environment, resulting from excessive time spent resting at the surface without the hydrodynamic support of deep water swimming.
So, when a captive orca lashes out at a trainer, we are not witnessing the reemergence of a dormant predatory instinct.
Not at all. Marine behaviorists are universally aligned on this conclusion. The fatal incidents in captivity are not hunting behaviors. They are the catastrophic culmination of an apex predator with high-level cognitive processing being driven into a state of acute psychosis by decades of unnatural confinement and trauma.
And the most chilling detail in the sources, the detail that really solidifies everything we've discussed about their dietary culture, is that even in the midst of these violent psychotic breaks, the biological rules hold. In none of the fatal captive incidents did the orca ever attempt to consume the human victim.
The distinction is vital. Even when the psychological pressure cooker results in lethal violence, the fundamental neuroacoustic programming remains intact. A human is not food. We are not prey. In a captive context, we are simply the focal point of an intelligent creature lashing out against its imprisonment.
If we synthesize the vast amount of data we've covered today, it forces a complete recalibration of how we view these animals. I mean, we started by analyzing the historical alliance in Twofold Bay, dissecting the tactical complexity of Old Tom's multi-stage ambushes, and the economic symbiosis of the law of the tongue. We saw how that relationship was built not on human dominance, but on thousands of years of indigenous Thawa spiritual integration, recognizing a shared intelligence in the water.
And we then explore the mechanics of their cognition, detailing how the Earth Species Project is utilizing foundation models to map the latent syntax of their acoustic communication. We examine the rigidity of their dietary culture, the fact that they will literally endure starvation rather than deviate from ancestral knowledge.
Right.
And we analyze the physics of their echolocation, proving that their sensory apparatus definitively categorizes human density and structure as anomalous, entirely removing the necessity for the exploratory test bites utilized by cartilaginous predators like sharks.
And we analyze the anomalies, proving that wild interactions are driven by hydrodynamic play or rare sensory misinterpretations, while captive attacks are the tragic, non-predatory result of psychological collapse.
The aggregate of this data presents a fundamental challenge to you, the listener, and your perspective on the ocean. We are culturally conditioned to view the ocean through a paradigm of terrestrial vulnerability. The assumption is that biological mass combined with predatory capability just equals an automatic threat to human life.
Which makes sense on land, but not here.
Exactly. The neurological and cultural complexity of the orca proves that marine ecosystems are not simply blind, mechanistic food chains. They're populated by distinct intelligences operating under rigid, ancient traditions. We are navigating an environment shared by minds that possess the physical capability to destroy us, but actively enforce a cultural mandate to leave us alone.
Which leaves a lingering, really provocative question derived from the trajectory of this AI research. We are currently utilizing massive computational power to map the hidden syntax of their communication. If the machine learning models eventually break the encryption of their dialects, providing us with a functional translation of their high-frequency clicks and pulsed calls, what happens when we listen to the historical recordings? What if we discover that they have possessed the vocabulary to communicate with us about the acoustic degradation of their environment this entire time? If the technology finally allows us to bridge the communication gap that existed between the Thawa whalers and the killers of Eden, when the connection is finally open, what will we have the capacity to say back? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We will see you next time.